Well, thank you all for joining. My name is Carlotta Lucas. I'm the head of industry at the Good Food Institute Europe, and welcome to the July Business of All Protein seminar. So today we'll be discussing the precision fermentation regulatory landscape around the world. This is actually our third webinar in a series focused on precision fermentation. The two previous ones we had in the spring, one was focused on market trends and opportunities, and another one on consumer research and nomenclature. So I think some of my colleagues will pop the links to those recordings in the chat in case of interest. If you want to learn more about the broader precision fermentation sector. And I feel very grateful today to be joined by many of our GFI colleagues from around the world who will each give an overview of the precision fermentation regulatory landscape in their region. So today you'll hear from Maddie Cohen, who's Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs at GFI US, Alison Soares, Head of Policy at GFI Brazil, Seth Roberts, a Senior Policy Manager at GFI Europe, and Sherry Heffer, Sustainability and Food Security Senior Manager at GFI Israel. Originally, our colleague Dean Powell from GFI APAC was also supposed to be joining us. Unfortunately, he is sick, so he's not joining us today, but we'll be sharing a recording from him afterwards with you where you'll still get to see kind of his slides and insights from the APAC region. So that'll be the first half hour or so today, where each of our colleagues will be presenting from their region. And at the end, we'll be joined by Marika Azoff, Corporate Engagement Manager at GFI US, who will be facilitating the Q&A. Before we get started, two quick housekeeping items. One, this seminar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. We'll also email this to you afterwards with the additional recording from GFI APAC and the presentation. And second, if you have questions throughout this presentation, please ask them in the Q&A box, not the chat. We won't be able to really keep track of them in the chat, and we'll answer those all at the end. So I think that's it for me for now, and I will hand it over to Maddie first to kick it off.
Great, thank you. Well, I will provide an overview of regulation in the United States, and then I will also briefly touch on Canada as well. But in the US, we have the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, that's responsible for overseeing safety, market entry, and labeling of fermentation-enabled foods, primarily under a statute called the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. When we're looking at fermentation-enabled foods, especially if we're talking about the novel ingredients themselves, there's generally two potential regulatory pathways set forth in the statute and FDA regs that companies can follow to ensure that their novel fermentation-derived ingredients can be sold in the US. The first is the food additive petition pathway, which is a fairly lengthy process involving consultation with the FDA and a formal petition to the agency requesting that the agency issue a regulation that would allow for specific uses of the ingredient in human foods. So this involves FDA doing a long safety consultation, determining what uses and at what levels the ingredient can be used, and then setting that forth in a regulation. And then that regulation has to go through the standard rulemaking process in the US, which itself is quite lengthy. It involves periods of notice and comment, so the public can comment on the regulation before it's finalized and published. So because of how long that process takes, and because of the fact that there's a significant amount of safety data for many fermentation-enabled and other novel ingredients, many follow the second pathway, which is the GRAS pathway. GRAS stands for Generally Recognized as Safe, and this pathway allows for certain ingredients and substances to be exempt from the food additive petition process if the producer of the ingredient can show that it's generally recognized among experts qualified by scientific training and experience to evaluate its safety as having been adequately shown through scientific procedures to be safe under the conditions of its intended use. So essentially, there is sufficient data and information out there for experts in the field to agree that this ingredient is safe for use in human foods, under specific conditions without the need to go through a full regulatory pathway. Notably, though, the FDA regulations require GRAS ingredients to meet the same safety standard that food additives have to meet to enter the market under the food additive pathway. So the safety standard is the same. And a determination that an ingredient is GRAS has to be based on the same quantity and quality of scientific evidence as is required to obtain approval of a food additive under the food additive pathway. So if a producer has sufficient evidence that their ingredient meets this GRAS standard, then they can choose to do something called self-affirmed GRAS, meaning that they just state and publish information stating that they have achieved GRAS status for their ingredient based on expert recognition and based on the data meeting those quantity and quality standards that FDA has set. This option for self-affirmation is currently the subject of a lot of debate in the United States, both at the legislative and regulatory levels. So this is subject to change in the future. But more commonly, producers will follow best practices and submit a GRAS notice to FDA. So a GRAS notice is a form. It's available on the FDA website. So you can see all the information that has to be included. And a company will fill out this form and submit it to the agency along with the evidence they have that they've used to determine that their ingredient is GRAS. That evidence includes publicly available research, scientific opinions, and other data. It might involve convening a panel of experts specifically to study and comment on the ingredient at issue, which is called a GRAS panel. FDA will then review this notice and the supporting information. They might come back to the company with more questions, ask for more data. And then once they have all of the available information about the ingredient, they'll make one of two decisions. They can say there's not enough information available at this time to determine that this ingredient is GRAS, so you have to go through the food additive petition pathway if you want to come to market. Or if there is sufficient information, the agency will issue what's called a no questions letter. And a no questions letter isn't an explicit approval of the product because that's not set out under the FDA regs, but it indicates that the agency doesn't question the conclusion that the ingredient is GRAS. And on this slide, I've just listed a few companies who've received no questions letters from FDA for their fermentation-enabled ingredients over the past few years. Next slide. FDA also has authority over labeling for foods made with fermentation-enabled ingredients. At this time, there aren't any fermentation-specific laws or regulations regarding labeling, but companies have to follow all of the standard labeling and nomenclature rules that FDA has set out. So that includes that, labeling must be truthful and not misleading. That includes things like accurate ingredient statements, nutrition information, everything else that applies to packaged food labels in the US. When it comes to nomenclature, some in the conventional dairy industry have urged FDA not to allow terms like milk or dairy on fermentation-derived products. But that's hard to justify given that precision fermented, milk proteins are real milk proteins and egg proteins are real egg proteins, not an analog or replacement. And they usually pose the same allergen risk as their conventional counterparts. So that accurate labeling is really important for these products. In terms of what companies are currently using, many are using terms like animal-free or non-animal to identify their dairy products. So, animal-free ice cream. Similar terms have also been used to identify the specific fermentation-derived proteins on the ingredient statement, such as non-animal whey protein. But it's still early and other nomenclature may solidify as these products become more widely available. Next slide. And then here, I just wanted to list a few other relevant rules and upcoming government actions that might affect fermentation-enabled products and that you might want to explore further. First is FDA's final rule laying out which products can be labeled as healthy or healthful or other variations on that word. So if you do want to use that terminology on your label, you have to make sure that your product meets the criteria that's set forth under the final healthy rule. The second is a recent proposed rule on front of pack nutrition labeling. So this hasn't been finalized yet. It's not law yet. But it would require a diagram like the one you can see here on the screen that displays the percent daily values of saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars on the front of packaged foods, and tell consumers whether those levels are considered low, medium, or high. And then finally, the Department of Health and Human Services, which is sort of the parent agency to FDA, as well as the US Department of Agriculture, just last week released a request for information on a federal definition for ultra processed foods. So they're in the process of collecting information. There's currently an open comment period. You can comment electronically through the Federal Register on what that definition should be. And there are several questions set out in the RFI to kind of prompt those specific data points that the agencies are looking for. And how the federal government chooses to craft this definition of ultra processed foods will affect both research into UPFs at places like NIH and other agencies, and also potentially regulation and labeling of processed foods. Next slide. Okay, moving on to Canada. Health Canada is the agency that has regulatory jurisdiction over fermentation-enabled foods. For the path to market, precision fermentation ingredients are assessed by the agency under the guidelines for the safety assessment of novel foods, which is published on the Health Canada website. In 2024, Health Canada issued its first ever letter of no objection for a precision fermentation protein, which was remilk's beta-lactoglobulin. Labeling is also a bit unclear in Canada. The letter of no objection suggested including the cell source, something like yeast derived, on the product packaging to ensure accurate labeling. It also noted that this product wouldn't meet the standardized definition of milk or various milk ingredients, and so couldn't use those names. But the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is the one responsible for enforcing food labeling rules, and they can be contacted directly for specific questions about labeling and nomenclature. And then finally, I will just flag two helpful reports that we published earlier this year. The first is the State of Global Policy Report, which provides a rundown of both global regulation and public investment in alt proteins. And the State of the Industry Report for fermentation includes an overview of the current fermentation industry, including product trends, investment and sales data, scientific advancements, public investment data, and more regulatory updates. And with that, I will pass it on to Allison.
Thank you, Maddie. Thank you very much. And hi, all. I'll be providing an overview of the regulation for fermentation for alternative proteins here in Brazil. So, in Brazil, GFI has been working since 2020 with the National Health Surveillance Agency, which we call Anvisa, a body linked to the Ministry of Health to promote the regulation of new foods and ingredients obtained through fermentation routes. To this end, we've held a series of meetings and workshops to align not only Anvisa, but also the Ministry of Agriculture, which will be responsible for innovation and labeling policies regarding fermented products. Next, please. So after all those workshops and engagement, in April 2023, Anvisa opened a public consultation asking for contributions to update the regulation of novel foods and ingredients in Brazil. The contribution made by GFI and previously aligned with the players in the sector was fully accepted. And I'll show you on the next slide. Still in December 2023, Anvisa published Resolution 839, which updated the list of new ingredients and foods in Brazil, as well as their parameters for proving safety. And this resolution included our contribution. Next, please. Actually, the previous one, this one. All right, thanks. The next one. Sorry, thank you. So, this resolution included products and ingredients obtained from fermentation techniques, including precision and biomass, in the regulation of novel foods and ingredients in Brazil, meeting a demand in line with the national sector itself. Next, please. That said, in general terms, the resolution establishes the path for registering new foods obtained by fermentation routes in the country, and according to Anvisa itself, the next steps will be taken after a product registration application has been received by an interested company as part of a learn by doing process. We therefore understand that the regulatory framework for this technology is already in place in Brazil, and we have an acknowledge of at least 2 companies undergoing the process so far. Both started in 2025. And with that, I'll pass the floor to Seth.
Thank you so much, Alison. Hi, everyone. My name is Seth Roberts. I'm a Senior Policy Manager at the Good Food Institute Europe, and I'm going to be talking you through the regulatory framework for products in the EU and the UK. So to kick us off, a little bit of context. So in the EU and the UK, companies who are looking to market innovative precision fermentation products must first apply for companies looking to market innovative precision fermentation products have got to apply for pre-market authorization of those products before they can be placed on the market. So you can't just come up with a innovative new precision fermentation product and look to sell it straight to consumers. First, you've got to look to undertake pre-market authorization by food safety agencies, and that is undertaken in collaboration with policymakers. So in the EU, we're talking about the European Food Safety Agency, or EFSA, and in the UK, that is done by the Food Standards Agency, or the FSA. Now, in neither jurisdiction is there a specific regulatory framework for precision fermentation products. They instead fit within existing EU and UK regulatory frameworks. Next slide. Thank you so much. So looking towards the EU first. So when we look at EU regulatory frameworks, pre-market authorization of foods is harmonized at the EU level. So the EU is a bloc, as hopefully most of you will know, of 27 different member states. There's no avenue for any of those individual member states to authorize foods being placed on the market unilaterally. Instead, they have to do it, in a harmonized way collectively, but member states are individually responsible for enforcement of food safety rules. Thinking about regulatory frameworks, there are 2 different metrics at play. The first is horizontal legislation, so things like the General Food Law, which apply to all food products which are looking to be marketed within the EU. And then there is a different metric, which is vertical legislation, which applies to specific categories of food. So if we think of meat or dairy, etc. And then on the next slide, I'll explain how that applies to precision fermentation. Yeah, so for EU vertical legislation for precision fermentation products, essentially the question more often than not will come down to, is the product going to be regulated under the novel food regulation, or is it going to be regulated under the genetically modified food and feed regulation? Now, there's a diagram of this on the right, which does quite a good job of summarizing this in kind of plain English. Basically, the key issue is genetically modified DNA found in the final product that the company is looking to market? Or is the final product itself derived from genetically modified organisms? If the answer to that is yes, then it's almost certain that the product will have to be regulated under the GM food and feed regulation. If that's not the case, and if the product is produced with a GMO, so for example, if you're using a GMO enzyme as a processing aid, but then filtering that enzyme out during the production process, then it could be the case that the novel food regulation would apply instead. And I've put at the bottom here that based on current EFSA guidance, the limit of detection for the absence of GMO data, DNA rather, is 10 nanograms per gram of product. So if you have more than 10 nanograms of GMO DNA in your final product, it's more likely than not that EFSA will assess you under the GM food and feed regulation. Next slide. Thanks very much. So having made that comparison and looking at the 2 different frameworks, it's helpful to clarify what's different about how these 2 frameworks actually work in practice. So to all intents and purposes, the novel food and the GM food and feed regulations are mutually exclusive. So if a product is being assessed under one, it's not going to be assessed under the other. And actually, in practice, they have very similar food safety requirements in terms of the amount of data that is requested from applicants. However, there are some key differences. So the first is time frame. So for an EFSA opinion under the GM food and feed regulation, we're looking at 6 months is what's statutorily expected, and it's 9 months under the novel food regulation. I would caveat that by saying that in practice, almost always both will take longer. That's due to the ability for EFSA to ask questions back to companies and ask for further information, further tests to be carried out. So 6 and 9 months are really the conservative end of the spectrum, but there is a difference there between the regulations. It's also worth noting that GM food and feed approvals are renewed every 10 years, whereas novel food approvals are permanent, or almost always permanent. And there's also a point that the European Commission has an outsized role in the authorization process compared to EU member states under the GM food and feed regulation. And I will talk about that maybe a little bit later in more detail. The most important thing to note, I think, is that we expect most precision fermentation derived alternative protein products to be authorized under the novel foods framework in the EU, based on conversations that we've had with industry. And it's worth saying that some already have been, such as precision fermentation, human milk oligosaccharides. Next slide. Great. I won't dwell on this slide too much because I think we'll be able to share the slides afterwards, but this is just a kind of schematic view of what the novel food framework looks like in practice, having said that most products will probably undergo this route to market. There are essentially three key steps. The first is the request for authorization. So this is when a company submits a food safety dossier to the European Commission. The European Commission notifies all 27 EU member state governments about that request being submitted. And then they undertake a very light touch completeness and validity check, basically making sure that the dossier is structured in an understandable way, the right kinds of buckets of evidence are in there, that kind of thing, which should take around 1 month. Again, it can take longer, but it should take around 1 month. The second stage is risk assessment. So the middle pillar on the screen in front of you now, that's risk assessment, kind of where the scientific opinion is formed on the safety of a product. So the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, undertakes safety analysis, including on nutritional, compositional, and allergenicity data, and essentially is looking to assess there whether a product is safe for human consumption. Now, that can take anywhere from 9 months to significantly longer, but 9 months is the kind of minimum that we're looking at there. And then next slide, I think the most interesting bit from my perspective as someone who has a background in policy is actually the third stage of the authorization process, and that is risk management. So after EFSA has said, we're happy with this product, we think it's safe, they then pass that information back to the European Commission, but that's not the final stage of the authorization process. That doesn't mean that you can go and sell your product. What happens then is called risk management in the EU. And this is where the European Commission will draw up an implementing act, which is a piece of tertiary legislation, which effectively states, we think this product is safe, but under these conditions of use, and we want to apply these suggested maximum intake levels when it comes to market. That implementing act will also discuss labeling requirements for the product. And then what happens is that the implementing act is discussed and voted on in a standing committee, which brings together 27 delegates from all 27 EU governments, and they actually vote on the approval of that implementing act by qualified majority voting, which I'm going to get wrong, but I think is 66% of member states, representing 55% of the European Union population, have to vote in favour for it to be approved. Now, what's interesting is that those member states don't just sign off automatically on what EFSA or the European Commission have said. Instead, they really do take a critical kind of analytical view of the product that's in front of them. And as I noted here, the regulation itself governing this states that scientific risk assessment alone cannot provide all of the information for risk management, but other factors like societal, economic, traditional, and environmental factors are legitimately considered. So it's not just food safety that determines. Thank you, Karen. I thought you might correct me on that. It's not just food safety that determines whether a product is approved or not, but rather there are other legitimate factors at play. So therefore, I think we can safely say that the authorization process in Europe is inherently political in nature. Next slide. And this is just some examples of that. So we have different European Union governments moving in very different directions with regards to their support for technologies like precision fermentation. I won't go into these in detail, but basically we can envisage a situation in which different member states, because of their different attitudes towards food technologies, the different coalitions of supporters that they have in a political context, will have different opinions on food technologies and bring those to bear in risk management. So it is not enough for a company necessarily to just have their product determined as safe by the by EFSA, but actually there are these political considerations that come into it as well. Next slide as well. Great, and then I'll look very briefly at the UK as well on the next slide. So the current UK landscape. So as I think most of us will know, in January 2021, the UK left the EU and exited the common EU food safety regime. So the UK was previously the 28th member state in the EU. There are now only 27 because the UK has left. But as of 2025, only relatively minor changes to the authorization framework has been announced in the UK. So although we have a separate regulatory framework in the UK, substantively, it's actually very similar in practice. The critical difference is that decision-making in risk management, that bit that I just talked about, has the potential to be shorter in the UK because we don't have 27 governments. We really only have, well, one in theory, the UK government, but that's in combination with a devolved administration, so Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. When you have fewer governments aligning on making a decision, it should be, theoretically, have the potential to be quicker. It's also worth noting that the UK government is adopting a more progressive and proactive approach to the regulation of precision fermentation products, and in 2025 announced £1.4 million worth of funding for an innovation hub to expand expertise in regulating precision fermented foods. That is as yet still to be launched. Next slide. So where we're at in terms of approvals in the EU and the UK. So today, a handful of companies working on precision fermentation, specifically for alternative proteins, have submitted safety dossiers in the EU and the UK. Those include applications for precision fermentation dairy ingredients, but also functional ingredients to enhance the flavour or texture of plant-based meats. It's worth saying that the cost and some of that complexity and that political uncertainty of the regulatory authorization process that exists in the EU and to a less extent in the UK can make it harder for some companies to justify food applications for their precision fermentation technologies. So there is a move in some companies, at least, to work towards cosmetics or other technologies as a kind of precursor to working on food-related files. And the bottom line, which I've emphasized already, but I'll reiterate again, is that in Europe, the approvals of technologies like precision fermentation for alternative proteins have the potential to be politicized. And it's therefore really important that the sector engages with policymakers and civil society and other groups to make the case for these technologies moving forward. And I will finish there.
Thank you, Seth. And hi, I'm Shiri, the Sustainability and Food Security Senior Manager at GFI Israel. I'll be happy to see the first slide. Yeah, thank you. As you can see, just to give the context, Israel has built a very proactive approach when it comes to alternative protein, and it can be seen both in the national funding priorities and in the regulatory environment. Beyond regulation, Israel has also built strong policy environment to support. Alternative protein have been declared as a national R&D priority, and the Israel Innovation Authority invested more than $16 million in 2024 into early-stage companies, research centers, and shared infrastructure. One important example is the public funding granted to YD Labs, a facility offering fermentation services to both biomass and precision fermentation startups. This kind of shared infrastructure helps reduce cost and accelerate the scale-up. The Ministry of Health, and specifically the Food Risk Management Unit at the National Food Service, is leading the proactive approach. They have been shown a strong commitment to building a smooth, science-based and user-friendly process for novel food approval. This includes not just approving products, but also actively supporting companies through the regulatory journey. Next slide, please. So how does it look like in practice? First, the Food Risk Management Unit created a one-stop shop for novel food application. Companies can begin with pre-submission consultation, which help clarify the requirements early and often leads to much better and smoother review. Then applications are reviewed during 2 or 3 official committee meetings each year, so there are multiple opportunities to move forward quickly. There are also formal submission guide that provides structure, but still leaves room for flexibility depending on the technology. This approach came to life during a pilot program where the ministry reviewed 4 alternative protein products, and 2 of these were precision fermentation proteins, and both received full approval under less than 1 year. Next slide, please. So we can take a look now at what we learned from the precision fermentation approval. They both approved proteins of non-animal beta-lactoglobulin, produced using engineered yeast and fungi. Both require allergen labeling to reflect their similarity to dairy proteins. The ministry also set strict condition, no reuse of the microbial strain, use is allowed only in pre-approved food categories, and infant and specialized nutrition are excluded. But most importantly, This wasn't about regulation, it was about capacity building. The ministry worked closely with the companies, issued public guidance, and shared learnings internationally. I know about the UK and the Singapore, but I think even with more countries here. The head of the unit even joined the GFI Regulatory Leadership Program and showing true collaboration. So overall, Israel process is not only scientifically sound, it's also structured, transparent, and actively supportive of innovation. Well, thank you, and I'm heading to Marika.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shiri, and to all of our presenters, and to all of you for your questions. Folks can, if the panelists could just come off camera and off mute, we will dive into these questions. And I'm just going to go in order of the presenters to give you all time to check out the questions asked. So the first one is for you, Maddie. Do you think that the potential changes to the self-assessment part of GRAS are likely to actually happen? Do you have a crystal ball?
Unfortunately not. I cannot predict what Congress or the administration might ultimately do. But we know the HHS secretary has instructed FDA to explore rulemaking to eliminate the self-GRAS option. So that is likely something that FDA is currently in the process of exploring. We also know that several members of Congress have already introduced bills that would modify the GRAS process, and several others have said they're planning to introduce bills this session that would modify GRAS as well. So based on all of that movement at one time, it definitely seems possible that there will be some sort of reform over the next few years.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddie. And how can folks kind of stay up to date on those occurrences and any changes made?
Yeah, FDA has a weekly newsletter that you can sign up for. You can set alerts through the Federal Register, which are free. So you can register for an account with the Federal Register and create search terms like GRAS or fermentation or other terms that might be helpful for tracking rulemaking or guidance in this space. And then there's also the OMB's website that shows through the OIRA dashboard when regulations or guidances are under regulatory review at the Office of Management and Budget.
Awesome. Thank you. And I've gotten a couple questions about like the recording and slides. Everything will be sent to you after this webinar. So even the Q&A. So, you will be able to hear Maddie saying that again. One more question for you, Maddie. In Canada, is Canada's letter of no objections similar to the US's no questions asked letter?
It's similar, but in Canada, the pre-market notification and receipt of that letter are required before a novel food can be sold. Whereas in the US, receiving a no questions letter isn't currently required for market entry, although notifying FDA is considered a best practice before commercialization.
Wonderful. Thank you. Alison, we have a question for you. With Brazil's evolving regulatory environment and the role of, and excuse my lack of, I don't know how to pronounce this acronym, Anvisa. So I'll start again. With Brazil's evolving regulatory environment and the role of Anvisa in overseeing novel food approvals, what are the most common roadblocks precision fermentation companies face there, and how can they proactively address them?
All right. So first of all, you did perfectly with the pronunciation. Okay, you can say Anvisa. It's just like that. So as for the question, the thing now is actually pretty a simple market viability and scalability question. So each business has to understand that as animal meat is very cheap in Brazil, achieving competitive prices requires scalability and a good logistics network. But as I said, we have some Brazilian companies already registering their products, and recently we have had a lot of international companies coming to us here at GFI Brazil to find out if they can apply to register their products. And the answer is yes, of course. Interested companies can find all the necessary information in Anvisa's Resolution 839 of 2023. And I think the link was sent here before, but anyway, our team has also a list of various regulatory consultancies that can help with the process. And please feel free to reach out. We're going to be more than happy to help you registering your products here in Brazil.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, maybe we'll send out kind of general email addresses for each of these regions in the follow-up email as well. All right, Seth, popular region, lots of questions for you. So first question, is there no avenue for MS to authorize foods unilaterally, but there are avenues for them to ban them unilaterally? This person admits to being French, or this being a very French question.
It's not uniquely French, actually. There are other member states which it would apply to as well. It's a good question. It's one that I spend a lot of my time thinking about, as you can imagine, and one I anticipated might come up today. But the honest answer is that at the moment it's an area of legal uncertainty. So there have been attempts by some member states. Most famous examples in the alternative protein space would be Italy and Hungary, looking to ban cultivated meats, both the production and the marketing of those products, so not specifically related to precision fermentation. But the issue is that until we have producers effectively who have secured regulatory authorization at the EU for their products and then are looking to put those products on the market, it's very difficult to know how that domestic legislation will stack up against EU legislation. So we don't know. It seems likely from our perspective as GFI Europe that there will be at least scope for legal challenges to those attempts to ban products unilaterally at the national level. But the honest answer is that for the time being, it's kind of a moot question because there's nobody trying to sell those products. So the imposition of that legislation is kind of, it exists, but it's not currently affecting anyone directly. So yes, I think it's something that in the years to come will be more and more of a pressing issue. It's something that I think legal experts around Europe should probably be teeing themselves up to engage with as a question. For the moment, I would say that we don't have a very firm and clear answer either way.
Thank you. In the EU, does a food product need to carry a contains GM produced ingredient label or disclaimer in the label if the amount of genetically modified DNA is less than 10 grams?
It's a good question. So again, all of this can be found within the GMO regulation. I think that's probably the best place to be looking for specific product inquiries. The relationship between labeling and GMOs for alternative protein products itself is still somewhat of a grey area because effectively none of these products have come to market yet. So we don't really have any alternative protein GMO products on the market yet. At the point to which they do begin to come onto the market, we'll see clarifications, we think, from the European Commission, from EFSA, about where that labeling or that kind of kite marking or whatever it looks to be in practice will be required, whether it will be back of pack, whether it will be front of pack, and what the kind of limits of detection will be. So again, not a 100% clear answer, but I think we will see in the coming couple of years, the first products make it through, and at that point, we'll see greater clarity required from regulators in Europe.
Awesome. And yeah, what's the best way to stay up to date on changes in the EU?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first one is to join the GFI Europe newsletter. So we have a newsletter you can sign up to on our website, which is excellent. And we look to try and put all of the key regulatory and wider kind of policy updates in that. There's lots of excellent regulatory consultants and third parties who work on this in the EU and the UK as well. So we have really good relationships with lots of consultants working on this issue. I think because of the political angle, which I mentioned, towards the regulatory process in Europe, there's a high kind of overlap between like legal and political consultancies as well that operate in this space. And the final thing is, much like I think in the US and Canada, like there are both the EU regulators, so EFSA, and the UK Food Standards Agency produce lots of really helpful resources. So whether that's from Open EFSA or Connect EFSA, maybe I can find a way to share this information with people afterwards. But there are lots of different resources like newsletters, scientific colloquium, which are organised, downloaded updates. There's lots of publicly available information, which is great as well.
Thank you. And Kimberly just popped the newsletter into the chat for all of you. Seth, I'm going to keep going with you, if that's okay. In the EU, are there any passporting opportunities or discussion of passporting opportunities between different jurisdictions?
It's a good question, and not something that I'm an expert on, to be honest with you. I think, yeah, I would need more expertise to be able to answer that question. I think it's worth saying that yeah, as I said, the food standards agency, food standard kind of regulations are harmonized at the EU level. So there's always this question about the EU single market, the ability to trade between member states, and how that is a critical foundational pillar, I think, of what the EU was formed upon. So the idea that food can move, or food goods can move seamlessly between countries and between different borders, is a kind of key pillar. But as I mentioned, there are increasing threats, I think, to that when certain member states are looking to ban technologies or products. There are questions that arise. So as with lots of things in the EU, it's a kind of ongoing question, and there's this constant battle between legal precedent, political appetite, and that kind of thing that will be worked out over the years to come.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So this was a clarifying question. Does the risk management process fall within that 18 to 36, or I guess 6 to 9 month time frame that you mentioned?
So no, so that is additional. So what we say is that the statutory, I think, expectation is that the entire process from start to finish in the EU or the UK will take around 18 months. So that is the kind of submission of a dossier, the completeness and validity, which takes about 1 month. Then we have theoretically 9 months of risk assessment, and then the rest of the process is taken up by risk management. As I think I put on my slides, very often this process can take up to 36 months, even longer. Risk management itself doesn't have a firm deadline, so member states can discuss particular products and postpone voting on them until they've got further answers, further clarifications, that kind of thing. So the process can extend much longer than 18 months, but that's the kind of minimum that's expected in statutes.
Thank you. A couple more for you. Do the same rules that you've kind of laid out in this presentation also apply to pet food companies containing animal proteins produced by microorganisms?
So in short, the answer is no, that there is a different regulatory approach for pet food companies. The requirements are slightly different. They're often described rather as being less stringent and robust. I'm not necessarily sure that's true. They just look for different things. Basically, there's different qualifications for a product to be able to sell to animals than it is for human consumption. There are some interesting examples. So in the UK, we recently had the first cultivated meat, again, not precision fermentation, but cultivated meat pet food product put on the market by a company called Meatly. They've actually done some of their own explainers about what went on in order for them to get that pre-market approval process. It was in some ways similar in terms of the data they had to submit and the explanations about their production processes and stuff like that. But in some ways it was quite different. So it was organized by a different bit of government. It was organized by the kind of Environment and Food and Rural Affairs Department rather than the Food Standards Agency. So there are some similarities, but actually there are quite significant differences. That process was also quite a lot quicker in the UK than we would expect it to be for a human novel food product.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a break for a minute and come back to you with a couple more questions and go to Shiri. Shiri, it's interesting. Someone commented that it's interesting to see all protein as such a big focus area in Israel. This person's curious why it was designated an area of national priority, and is wondering if you think other nations in the Middle East might follow suit.
Maybe I start from the end, that I hope that other nation in the Middle East will follow soon, and we are, even in this horrible situation we are now in, we hope that the food and the alternative protein will help bridge some gaps and create a connection. We have a lot of connections with our neighbors around innovation, like water and energy and else, and so we hope food will follow. And why? I think it's because we are innovation tech people, and with curiosity for food, and with a lot of pharma and biotechnology students and knowledge, and yeah, and good and proactive work of GFI Israel.
Awesome. Thank you. And one more question for you. Is precision fermentation innovation also internationally portable once it's approved and established by the Israeli jurisdiction?
So unfortunately not, and we could see that Imaginary that got her first approval here, then followed in the United States. So every nation has to follow. We usually follow others, but just in novel food, as we are a very proactive country for novel food, for alternative protein, we sometimes do it first.
Thank you, Sherry. All right, Seth, a couple more for you. This person's wondering about kind of the transparency of the status of each application for stakeholders. So as companies go through the process, is there any transparency for stakeholders?
There is, and in fact, I will post a link in the chat, which is helpful. So there's this service called OpenEFSA, which is basically has information on every authorization application which has been submitted in the EU. So that's not just for novel foods. You can look at that for GM food and feed, for food additives, lots of different categories. You can just type in the search bar if you're interested in a particular company or a particular product, and it will come up there with every communication between the regulator and the company, and also information on expected timelines for authorization of products.
Thank you. And this question, would you say that the authorization in the US, or sorry, in the UK is easier than in the EU?
Yeah, good question. How long is a piece of string in some ways? I think that the fact that risk management is conducted by fewer governments, as I made the point earlier, means that the process has the potential to be quicker. That doesn't necessarily mean that the process will be easier, but I think there is from my perspective, it's easier to imagine having clarity and predictability on timelines when you only have negotiations within one government effectively, rather than 27 governments coming together to assess a particular product. I think the second thing to say is that we've broadly seen more political support in the last couple of years for alternative protein categories, in particular in the UK. So there have been things like, as I mentioned, this new innovation hub and the funding that went with it for alternative protein products. The UK has also launched a sandbox program for cultivated meat. There are real signs of kind of political support and political will that surround the kind of regulatory process in particular, that make me think that I guess should give confidence to stakeholders in that sector. So it's not necessary to say that one is easier than the other. In fact, in some ways, they're very similar, because the food safety requirements that would apply in one will be very similar to the other. But the kind of tertiary things, the political support, the expectations around timelines and stuff like that might potentially be more favorable in the UK moving forward.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right, Allison, we have one for you. Do you have any information relating to approvals in Central America for precision fermentation products?
Yes, actually, I do. I was in Chile earlier this year, and we have news that over there are product registrations. And we know that in Mexico there are some companies working with that, but I'm not sure if I can say that there are already registered products there. So I'm going to stick to Chile. And in this case of Chile, there is a recently created specific association for the sector, fermentation and cell cultivation, which is called Cell Ag Chile. I can write the name here on the chat later, but they just founded an association for the sector, so there are lots of things going on there. That's for sure.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, if you don't mind popping that in the chat, that would be great. All right. Have any microalgae derived products been approved in Canada, US, or Europe? Maddie, do you want to speak to this briefly?
Yeah, certainly in the US, there have been a couple that have achieved GRAS status. I can drop a link in the chat to an article that mentions a few of those, but you can also search FDA's GRAS notice inventory to see which ones have received a no questions letter in the US. I'm not sure about Canada without looking.
Thank you. Seth, I know it's a little off topic. Anything from you?
Yeah, so the same is true. So there have been a couple of microalgae products that have been approved in the EU, both as novel foods, but also as food and feed supplements as well. So again, if you go on the open EFSA link that I put in the chat. You'll be able to type that in, and hopefully we'll come up with the relevant products that have either been approved or are undergoing approval at the moment.
Thank you. All right. One question, I think this is kind of for anyone who wants to come off mute and answer. Are the different regions working toward a standard precision fermented food products regulation in order to minimize the go-to-market times for producers? In other words, are the food agencies around the world considering accepting products that already received a pre-market approval in another region, at least for countries with similar risk assessment processes? Is any of that coordination taking place to any of your knowledge?
So I do know that Health Canada and Food Standards Australia and New Zealand collaborate on pre-market reviews for genetically modified foods. So if there is a producer that wants to enter both markets, they can do this joint application, and one of the two agencies will actually conduct the safety evaluation and write its report, share that with the other jurisdiction, and then each jurisdiction makes its own independent determination of whether that product can come to market based on the safety assessment. So that's kind of the biggest one I am aware of, and it does seem like a potential opportunity to expand those sorts of bilateral pre-market review processes.
Thanks, Maddie. Anything else on that?
Maybe I would just jump in and say that there have been commitments in the UK in recent months from the Food Standards Agency to explore this further. So it's very much a case of kind of waiting and seeing whether that would happen, bilaterally. So the UK, sharing risk assessment data with other countries, or I don't think we're going to get to a stage where a product approved in another market is automatically approved in the UK. That feels like it's a long way off. But the sharing of data, sharing of evidence feels more possible, whether on a bilateral basis, as I say, or multilaterally as well. So there are other interesting fora that could take place in, whether that looks like the FAO, other different multilateral organizations as well. So yeah, watch this case. I know that there are ambitions in the UK in this space as well.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, sorry, very quickly, it's important to also to say that the WCO has been talking about this, so we can go any further right now, but there have been talks globally for a global regulation, for a global standard not rising, but so far it's only talks.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we will definitely share opportunities for you to ask more questions. And this I think for some of you to talk about your policy work in general at GFI, but this person's asking, does GFI plan to run any trainings for regulatory authorities around the world that might be interested in learning best practices in regulating precision fermentation derived proteins? I know that the Israeli regulator is proactive in connecting with other countries and sharing insights, and potentially the same in Brazil, it sounds like. Does anyone want to speak to that? How GFI is engaging with these regulating bodies?
As I told you, we are in good connection with the regulatory body, and it's the head of the unit is Dr. Ziva Hamama, which we are in close relationship. She joined our leadership program this year, and we're working with her on many initiatives. And we know from her that she is working with some countries like the UK and Singapore to help and share insights and promote better process to regulate and improve precision fermentation and other alternative proteins. But beside that, we don't have current initiative beside what she's doing proactive independently.
I'll add that GFI is an observer organization to the Codex Alimentarius Commission. So we do provide both scientific and policy expertise through committees and working groups within Codex. Right now, there aren't currently any proposals for new work that are directly related to precision fermentation, but if any of those come up in the future, that'll certainly be something that we're directly involved in as an observer.
Great. Wow. Thank you all for all of these insights. Huge thank you to Maddie, Allison, Seth, and Shiri for your time and expertise. And thank you so much for all of the questions. Carlotta mentioned that this is the third webinar in a series of 3. And the first 2, we got so many regulatory questions that we were like, all right, let's host a webinar. And I'm glad that you all came with questions and interests. So please continue to let us know what you're interested in learning about because we're listening. I'll say again that this webinar has been recorded and will soon be available on our YouTube channel. You'll also get an email of the recording, a copy of the deck, along with a video recording from our colleagues at GFI APAC, who weren't able to join, and some additional resources from our GFI India team as well. And as GFI continues to drive progress in this alternative protein universe, we really encourage you to share your ideas and feedback with us. One way to do so is by emailing us at corporate@gfi.org. And you can always respond to the email that we send with all of the recordings and whatnot. Thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your day.